Christopher LePore thought he could outsmart everyone, especially Barry Schmalbach. But when greed, manipulation, and betrayal collided, the truth couldn't stay buried forever. What started as a friendship ended in a shallow grave, and a chilling case that shocked a community. Watch until the end to see how Christopher's lies unraveled, and how one man's quiet warnings became the key to solving his own murder. Subscribe for more gripping true crime stories every week, and don't forget to like, comment, and share if this case left you speechless. Barry Schmalbach was the kind of man who didn't make enemies. At 64, he lived a peaceful, predictable life in the small town of Mount Laurel, New Jersey. A retired high school history teacher, he spent his days tending to his garden, helping neighbors with odd jobs, and volunteering at the local food pantry. His routines were familiar to everyone on the block: early morning walks with his dog, coffee at the same diner every Thursday, and lunch with his sister every other Sunday. He wasn't flashy or particularly outgoing, but he was dependable, kind, and deeply trusted by those who knew him. That's why it felt so wrong when Barry suddenly stopped answering his phone. His sister, Donna, tried calling him several times after he didn't show up to their scheduled lunch. At first, she thought maybe he'd just lost track of time. But the next day, when she still hadn't heard from him and his phone kept going to voicemail, she drove to his home. His car was in the driveway, the porch light was still on from the night before, and the mailbox was full. When she knocked, no one answered. She peered through the windows. Everything inside looked neat, untouched. Still, something felt off. Donna called the police that afternoon. Officers conducted a welfare check. They found no signs of forced entry, no sign of a struggle. Barry's wallet and keys were missing, but his phone was still on the kitchen counter. His dog, Max, was out of food and water, which suggested Barry hadn't been home for at least 2 days. But if he had left voluntarily, why hadn't he told anyone? And why hadn't he taken his phone? By the end of the week, missing person flyers were posted all over town. The story made the local news. Friends, neighbors, and even former students joined the search. People combed through parks, wooded areas, and nearby trails. Volunteers created a Facebook group to gather tips. Some believed he had suffered a medical emergency while hiking. Others feared he'd been the victim of a robbery gone wrong. But there were no clues. No credit card activity. No ATM withdrawals. No messages. Just a man who seemed to have vanished without reason or warning. Police began to dig deeper into Barry's life. They spoke with neighbors, family members, and anyone who might have seen him in the days leading up to his disappearance. Most said the same thing. Barry was calm, healthy, and in good spirits. Nothing seemed out of place. But one neighbor mentioned seeing an unfamiliar man on Barry's porch 2 nights before he went missing. She didn't know who he was, but said he looked younger, maybe mid-30s, and seemed agitated. That small detail would later prove critical. For now, though, Barry's case remained a mystery. And in a town where everyone thought they knew everyone, the silence around his disappearance felt suffocating. As the investigation into Barry Schmalbach's disappearance unfolded, one name kept surfacing: Christopher LePore. He wasn't a close friend or a family member. In fact, most people who knew Barry only vaguely recognized the name. But Christopher had been in Barry's orbit for almost a year. He had initially responded to a flyer Barry posted at the community center looking for help with yard work and small household repairs. At first, he was polite, punctual, and grateful. Barry, always eager to help someone down on their luck, hired him on the spot. It didn't take long for Christopher to become a regular presence at Barry's home. He mowed the lawn, cleaned gutters, helped move boxes from the attic, and even joined Barry for coffee now and then. Barry believed he was doing something good, giving a man a second chance. He knew that Christopher had a complicated past. There were whispers about drug use, financial troubles, and brushes with the law. But Barry wasn't one to judge. He believed in people's ability to change. Unfortunately, that trust would prove to be dangerous. Christopher's behavior started to raise eyebrows almost immediately after Barry was reported missing. He showed up at the house while police were still interviewing neighbors, claiming to be one of Barry's closest friends. He gave statements about the last time he saw Barry, saying it was a week before the disappearance and that everything seemed normal. But as detectives continued questioning him, the details kept shifting. One minute he said Barry was planning a short trip to visit an old friend, the next he claimed Barry had mentioned feeling unsafe in the neighborhood. None of it aligned with what others were saying. Officers began looking more closely at Christopher's background. What they found was troubling. He had a history of manipulation and deception, past charges of forgery, petty theft, and impersonation. In one case, he had convinced an elderly woman to give him power of attorney before draining her bank account. Another time, he posed as a contractor and took deposits for work he never completed. Each time, he talked his way out of serious consequences, often disappearing before law enforcement could track him down. More alarmingly, Christopher seemed far too involved in the investigation. He attended community search events, inserted himself into interviews with local reporters, and constantly contacted Barry's sister, offering theories and false leads. Investigators noticed he was overly eager, almost theatrical, in his concern. It felt less like worry and more like performance. Then came the surveillance footage. A gas station camera had captured Christopher filling up his truck just a few blocks from Barry's home on the same day Barry was last seen. His initial statement claimed he hadn't been in the area that day at all. The lie was small, but it opened the door to bigger questions. Why was Christopher so involved? Why did he keep changing his story? And most importantly, what wasn't he saying? With no physical evidence yet and no body, investigators had to tread carefully. But one thing was becoming clear: Christopher LePore was no good Samaritan. He was a man with secrets, and the deeper detectives looked, the darker those secrets became. Detectives were running out of leads. Weeks had passed since Barry Schmalbach vanished, and the trail was growing cold. There were no witnesses, no physical evidence tying anyone to the disappearance, and no signs of a struggle at his home. Despite community-wide searches and media coverage, there was still no sign of Barry. But investigators weren't giving up. They turned their attention to Barry's digital life, hoping something, anything, might help them understand what had happened. That's when they uncovered a trail that would reshape the entire investigation: his email inbox. At first glance, Barry's emails were exactly what one would expect from a quiet, retired man. There were grocery coupons, newsletters from his church, and updates from former students. But deeper in the archives, investigators found something unsettling. Tucked between the mundane were several messages exchanged between Barry and Christopher LePore. The tone of the messages was strained. Barry was polite, but clearly uncomfortable. He had written to Christopher about money, specifically, a loan. According to the emails, Barry had lent Christopher over $5,000 over a span of several months. It started small, $200 for a car repair, then another $400 for rent. But the requests kept coming. Each time, Christopher promised to repay him soon. Barry, trusting and patient, gave him the benefit of the doubt. But as the months passed and the money remained unpaid, Barry began to pull back. In one email, he mentioned feeling taken advantage of. In another, he said he no longer felt safe. Then there was the draft. It had never been sent, but it was saved in Barry's account just days before he disappeared. In it, Barry wrote that he was going to contact the authorities. He explained that he believed Christopher had been showing up at his home uninvited, possibly watching him from a distance. He described feeling nervous and increasingly isolated. He also mentioned that Christopher had become aggressive and unpredictable after being told that no more money would be loaned. This unsent message shifted the tone of the investigation immediately. It gave detectives not only a motive, financial desperation, but also a glimpse into the psychological pressure Barry may have been under. He had trusted someone who had slowly turned threatening. And most importantly, he had documented his fears. Investigators subpoenaed Christopher's financial records. They found no signs of stable employment or income. His bank statements revealed overdrafts, gambling charges, and cash withdrawals, consistent with someone living well beyond their means. He had no assets, no savings, and was months behind on rent. His desperation was obvious. Meanwhile, phone records showed multiple calls from Christopher to Barry in the final week before the disappearance. Most were unanswered. There were also several texts from Christopher asking to talk in person and clear things up. One message read, "You owe me a chance to explain." The pieces were beginning to connect. Barry had loaned money to someone with a pattern of manipulation. He had grown fearful. He was preparing to cut ties and report everything. Then he disappeared. Investigators were no longer searching for a missing person. They were closing in on a likely suspect in what was increasingly being viewed as a calculated act of violence. The break in the case came nearly 3 months after Barry Schmalbach first went missing. By then, hope had faded. His disappearance had gripped the community, but without new information, even the most dedicated search efforts began to stall. That changed on a humid morning in late July when a local hiker, exploring an overgrown wooded area just outside of town, noticed a strange shape near a creek bed. It was a plastic tarp, partially buried beneath leaves and dirt. At first, he thought it might be trash, until he saw what looked like bone. Police were called immediately. The scene was sealed off, and forensic teams were brought in. What they uncovered confirmed the community's worst fears. Inside the tarp was a body, badly decomposed but intact enough for identification. Dental records later confirmed it was Barry Schmalbach. He had been wrapped tightly, bound at the wrists, and buried in a shallow grave, just deep enough to conceal but not enough to last. It appeared to be a rush job, done by someone who wanted the body hidden but wasn't skilled in covering their tracks. The autopsy revealed that Barry had died from ligature strangulation. There were bruises around his neck, as well as cuts and abrasions on his hands, indicating he had tried to fight back. No drugs or alcohol were found in his system, and there was no evidence he had been incapacitated before the attack. This was personal. It was brutal. And it confirmed what many feared: Barry had been murdered. But what sealed Christopher LePore's fate was what the killer left behind. Hidden inside the folds of the tarp, wedged between layers of plastic, was a small, crumpled receipt. It was damp, partially faded, but still legible. It showed a purchase made just days after Barry was last seen: duct tape, gloves, and a tarp. The receipt listed the date, time, and store location. When detectives pulled surveillance footage from that hardware store, the image was clear: Christopher LePore, wearing a gray hoodie, standing at the checkout counter with those exact items. It was the first piece of hard evidence tying Christopher to Barry's death. Investigators acted quickly. A search warrant was issued for Christopher's residence. There, they found traces of the same tarp material in a trash bin behind his apartment. They also recovered a pair of work boots with soil and organic material matching the area where Barry's body had been found. Forensic teams would later confirm the dirt composition was identical, another nail in the coffin. Christopher was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. At first, he denied everything. He claimed the tarp and tape were for moving furniture. He said he hadn't seen Barry in weeks. But the evidence was overwhelming. The changing stories, the financial motive, the threatening emails, the store footage, and now, undeniably, the body. The discovery in the woods ended the long, agonizing mystery of Barry's disappearance. And it shifted the story from a missing person case to a homicide investigation with a clear suspect and a chilling motive rooted in greed, betrayal, and control. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed in. After months of investigation, weeks of testimony, and hours of deliberation, the moment had finally come. Christopher LePore sat still at the defendant's table, dressed in a dark suit that did little to mask the weight of what was coming. The jurors did not look at him as they passed. When the foreperson read the verdict, guilty on all counts, there was no outburst, no dramatic reaction. Just the quiet sound of justice settling into place. The prosecution had presented a devastating case. They meticulously laid out the timeline, starting with Barry's growing discomfort and ending with the gruesome discovery in the woods. They showed the jury the emails and the unsent draft that detailed Barry's fear and his intent to report Christopher. They showed the hardware store receipt, the surveillance footage, the matching soil on Christopher's boots, and the recovered items from his trash. Piece by piece, they painted a portrait of a manipulative man who believed he could charm his way out of anything, even murder. Witnesses took the stand to testify to Christopher's patterns. Former acquaintances described how he had gained their trust, borrowed money, and then vanished when it came time to repay. One elderly woman cried as she described how Christopher had convinced her to sign over access to her bank account under the pretense of helping her manage bills. In each story, the pattern was the same: manipulate, exploit, abandon. The defense tried to shift blame, suggesting that someone else could have been responsible, but they offered no alternative theory that made sense. Their attempts to undermine the evidence fell flat. The jury saw through it. They saw a man who had pushed his luck too far, who thought he was smarter than everyone else in the room, and who had taken a life when he could no longer control the person he was using. When the sentence was handed down, life in prison without the possibility of parole, Christopher showed little emotion. But to those in the courtroom, especially Barry's family, the verdict brought a sense of finality. They had endured sleepless nights, unanswered questions, and the unbearable pain of not knowing what had happened. Now they knew the truth, even if it would never bring Barry back. In the weeks that followed, Barry's story spread beyond his small New Jersey town. News outlets covered the trial, highlighting the dangers of blind trust and the quiet manipulation that can hide behind a friendly face. The case served as a reminder of how predators can present themselves as victims, and how even the kindest people, like Barry, can fall prey to calculated deceit. Christopher LePore believed he could control the narrative. He thought he could lie, deflect, and insert himself into the investigation just enough to appear helpful. But in the end, his arrogance was his undoing. His manipulation didn't work. His performance failed. And the truth, buried in a shallow grave, rose to the surface, louder and stronger than any lie he could tell.